I hope you're well. I was given a request, although I myself do not mind questions during the shir, but a number of people requested that maybe we could hold off questions until after the class or towards the end of the class and the like. Yeah, I was just saying that although I myself personally have no objection to questions during the class, but a number of people did request that you hold off questions till maybe towards the end of the class because it breaks up the continuity. Again, I just to clear my own name, it's not the objection is not coming from me, it's coming from members of the class. I actually don't like to shut off questions, but sometimes people feel that it interrupts the continuity of things. We are still looking. Okay, the mic is working, right? We are still looking at Mamar Kiddush Hashem, and the Rambam now goes into the halachic aspect. And here is the thing. The Rambam first develops a certain definition of what is Kiddush Hashem, what is the sanctification of God's name, and what is the opposite, what is Chilul Hashem, what is the desecration of God's name. Because there actually is a positive commandment in the Torah to sanctify God's name. V'niktashti b'toch adas b'nei Yisrael. And there is a negative commandment to desecrate God's name. V'lo sechalalu es shem kodeshi. So two of the 613 mitzvos is the mitzvah taseh of Kiddush Hashem, and the mitzvah lo ta'aseh of Chilul Hashem. The problem is that Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem are not necessarily clearly defined terms. It's not like a mitzvah to put on tefillin or a mitzvah to not do malacha on Shabbos. So they have to be given a content. They have to be given a definition. So the Rambam first says that there is a general standard of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, and the Rambam breaks it down into two. Actually, he talks about Chilul Hashem in the sense. There is the idea, which is the familiar idea, that when you behave in a way that brings Judaism or Torah or God into disrepute by virtue of your behavior, right? This is the common definition, actually. This is what we call Chilul Hashem, even if there is no technical violation of halacha, meaning even if you're not transgressing anything else, if your behavior brings Torah into disgrace or disrepute, that is called Chilul Hashem. To give you a contemporary example, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach actually paskined that you're not supposed to form minyanim on airplanes if that's going to block the aisle or block people's access to either the bathroom or the stewardesses from delivering food, whatever it would be, because that would be a paradigm of Chilul Hashem. People are going to say, oh, that's what religious Jews do, they don't care about people and the like. I don't want to get too political, but many people think the hafganot that we're always having here, blocking traffic and the like to protest government action, might fall under the category of Chilul Hashem, throwing stones at not religious Jews or throwing even bags of excrement at women at the wall. Many consider that to be Chilul Hashem. So that's a general idea of Chilul Hashem. Don't do things that cause a disgrace on the part of Torah. Now, the Rambam makes the point that, interestingly enough, the greater you are, the more chashuv you are, the higher the standard is going to be. So, if an eighth grader pushes somebody out of line or is rude, maybe that's not a Chilul Hashem because kids are kids, or maybe it's a small Chilul Hashem. But if you had a great Rosh Yeshiva speak rudely to people, that's a much bigger Chilul Hashem. So the Chafetz Chaim once criticized the Talmud for doing things that are a Chilul Hashem. So the Talmud says, Rabbi, I'm nobody important. So what I do does not reflect on Judaism. So the Chafetz Chaim said, it's a mitzvah to be humble. But when it comes to Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, you have to be a Baal Gaiva. You have to look at yourself as like the greatest rabbi in the world and behave accordingly. Because the truth of the matter is, we are judged as representatives. I mean, certainly, I think often of the yeshiva student that comes home to a small community where there aren't that many Orthodox Jews. Now, he may not be any big Talmid Chacham, but he will certainly be considered to be the standard bearer of what Yiddishkeit is. And as a result, every single action will be scrutinized for its Kiddush Hashem or Chilul Hashem. So in short, the basic definition, which I think most of us already kind of worked with, is Kiddush Hashem is when people look at you and say, if this is the way a Torah Jew lives, that's a good and wonderful thing. Chilul Hashem is when people look at you and say, if this is what a Torah Jew does, that is a despicable thing. Which means, according to that definition, which is our basic definition, there always has to be an observer, meaning Chilul Hashem and Kiddush Hashem is a function of people, Jews or non-Jews. And actually, Chilul Hashem vis-a-vis Jews is even bigger. Jews or non-Jews. In other words, there has to be an observer, meaning what you're doing privately, one would assume does not enter into the definition of Chilul Hashem and Kiddush Hashem. But then, somewhat surprisingly, the Rambam says, there is a concept of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem even in private. You're doing stuff, nobody even knows what you're doing. But the Rambam says, if a person commits Averos with an attitude of indifference, I just don't care. Meaning, you can do an Avera because the Yetzer Hara grabs you. You just have this unbelievable hunger for a ham sandwich. Okay, it's not justifiable, but okay, you gave in to your taiva. That's one thing. But if you do an Avera simply because I don't really care, so the Rambam actually calls that a desecration of God's name. It's very interesting. Totally private, not because other people saw you, and not because other people will judge you or judge Torah in a negative way, but simply because the attitude of indifference towards God's will in itself is a Chilul Hashem. That's a very interesting notion of private Chilul Hashem. So we have public Chilul Hashem, we have private Chilul Hashem, but then we have a third category, and the Rambam, interestingly enough, and there's not a clear makor in the Gemara, and that is, whenever there is a duty to give your life for God, when you give your life for Hashem, that is called Kiddush Hashem. When you don't give your life when you should have done so, that is called a Chilul Hashem. Now, again, it's very, very important to understand the following. Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem do not define when you must give your life, meaning when you must give your life is defined by other rules, other psukim. In other words, Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem do not give you any definition of when there's a duty of martyrdom, but the Rambam learns once we know there is a duty of martyrdom, that will become subsumed under the definition of Kiddush Hashem, and a person who does not give his life when there's a duty of martyrdom, that is called a Chilul Hashem. And if that was done privately, that is a Chilul Hashem that is private. If it is done publicly, we'll define what publicly means, that is a Chilul Hashem public. Okay, so that's an interesting point. So in a sense, we have three categories of Chilul Hashem. We have general behavior that brings Judaism into disrepute. We have even private behavior that represents an indifference to the service of God. And then we have martyrdom when there is a duty of martyrdom. Then if you do give your life, that is Kiddush Hashem. When you fail to give your life, when there's a duty of martyrdom, there is Chilul Hashem. And the Rambam brings many Mamorei Chazal that talk about the great Olam Haba for those who die al Kiddush Hashem. Now, there is a very, very interesting question about this notion of dying al Kiddush Hashem. We often say about the people who were killed in the Holocaust, that they died al Kiddush Hashem, or we say about Chayolim, that they died al Kiddush Hashem. Let's take the Holocaust first. It actually is a little bit of a difficult issue because what is the sanctification of God's name when you give your life? It seems to presuppose a certain element of choice or volition, meaning the Crusades. They go over to me and say, become Christian or I will kill you. And a person declares, my commitment to God is so great that I will die before I renounce God and his Torah. So that is called sanctification of God's name because you're placing your allegiance to God even above your life. And that is stating how important that is. But that's because you had the choice. You could have become Christian or professed Christianity, and you didn't. Now, in the case of the Holocaust, what's interesting is there was not that element of choice. Meaning Hitler didn't say, become Christian and you will be saved, and if not, I will kill you. In fact, there were Jews who converted to Christianity for various reasons, and they died in Auschwitz as well. In fact, there's a woman, Edith Stein, who is actually a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, who was a Jewish woman who became a Carmelite nun, and she died. Now, the part of how the church canonized her was she was treated as a martyr to her faith. It's hard to know why she's a martyr to her faith. She didn't die because she was a Christian. She died because she was a Jew. But the question becomes this. Again, maybe it's a painful question to raise. How is it Kiddush Hashem if a person is going to be killed no matter what they profess when there was no choice that could have gotten them out of the situation? So some say, well, even if you don't have choice, there can be Kiddush Hashem in the nobility by which you choose to die. Rav Dessler, Rav Elio Dessler, the great Michtav Elio, who came from Kelm, which was a city on the Lithuanian-German border. And before World War II, he had already moved to England, and after the war, eventually to Eretz Yisrael. But his whole family was wiped out in Kelm. Kelm was a small town, but it was a great, great city of Musar. And a famous, famous, famous school of Musar, run by Rav Simcha Zissel Brady, and then his sons and sons-in-law. He's called the Alter of Kelm, the old man of Kelm, etc. He was probably Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's dominant Talmud. And Rav Dessler lost his whole family in the massacre of Kelm, which was just one of many, many massacres. And there was a survivor, an eyewitness, and Rav Dessler spent hours and hours trying to reconstruct from the eyewitness exactly what happened. And he described the massacre of Kelm in his writings. And he talks about the idea that before the Nazis were going to round people up, the Rosh Hashiva, Rav Daniel Vashevitz, spoke to his Talmidim and says, we're about to die to serve God. It's important that we're like a korban, that we don't allow any foreign thought to passel us. And there was a calmness and a reverence and a preparation for death. And ad kedei kach, that it says, the Nazi murderers were themselves a little discombobulated. They had never seen human beings approaching death with such inner serenity and calmness. They were used to people screaming, crying. That was part of the regimen. They wanted people to be humiliated and just beg, and then they could shoot them. And these were not beggars at all. They were just preparing to meet God. And it mentions that when the Nazi was given the order to shoot, he turned to his superior officer and said, these people are not people. These are not humans. They're angels. Maybe we can just forget about them. It was an amazing thing that the Nazi himself was seized with a pachad and a moga. Of course, his superior conquered that Yetzer Hara, and of course they were machine gunned. They were massacred. But Rav Dessler writes that that's also an aspect of Kiddush Hashem, the way you meet your fate, accepting God's will without complaint, accepting God's will with serenity and calmness. Now, again, that still doesn't explain every Holocaust scenario. So there actually is a reference in Igeret Mamar Kiddush Hashem as a very side reference, where some interpret, the language is ambiguous, I have to be honest, that the Rambam also maintains, in addition to the Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem that we've already talked about, anyone who is killed because he is a Jewish person is nichlal in Kiddush Hashem, meaning the fact that you were singled out because you're Jewish. So, obviously, if a Jewish person gets killed in an automobile accident, that would not be called dying al Kiddush Hashem. The person just died, okay. But if a person is killed because they're Jewish, which of course was the Holocaust, and one could actually say it's the same thing with Chayalim. I mean, there are non-Jewish soldiers in the army, but by and large, the wars against the state of Israel are wars against the Jews. So that's a very interesting definition, because according to that, it makes no difference, religious, non-religious. It makes no difference, choice or not choice. The very fact that somebody was killed because they are Jewish or were Jewish in itself may constitute a Kiddush Hashem, which is an interesting point about the Holocaust, which is why we say they are considered to be martyrs al Kiddush Hashem. But as I say, the underlying logic of that is not as clear as one would hope, and the Rambam's language is also not as clear as one would hope. But this is, I'm sure you probably have heard this. This is actually a common paraphrase of the Rambam's view that he who dies because they're Jewish died al Kiddush Hashem. Now, I will say this: in the case of a chayal, there may be something better than a Holocaust survivor. I don't mean a survivor, I mean a Holocaust victim, because the chayal actively is giving his life to help the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. Now that is not just he got killed because he's a Jew. He got killed in the course of being Moser Nefesh for Yisrael. There, I think you actually do have a strong case that is called al Kiddush Hashem, because of that devotion to Yisrael. I've mentioned before, forgive me for repeating, that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who lived in Shari Chesed, but his yeshiva Kol Torah is in Bayit Vagan. So he once encountered one of his Talmidim who was going up to Tzfat to daven by the Kivrei Tzadikim, the kever of the Arizal, Rav Yosef Karo, if you've ever been to the great ancient cemetery of Tzfat, all sorts of great people are in that cemetery, and he wanted to daven by their kever, and it's right next to Meron. Meron is right across the valley, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said to him, why do you have to schlep all the way to Tzfat to daven by the grave of tzaddikim? We're right in Bayit Vagan. We can go to Har Herzl. We can go, when it says, when I need to daven by the grave of tzaddikim, I just go to the military cemetery on Mount Herzl, and I daven by the kever of a chayal who gave his life al Kiddush Hashem for Klal Yisrael. And those are considered to be kivrei tzaddikim that one can daven by. Again, of course, you're not praying to the tzaddik, but whatever the union of kivrei tzaddikim is, Rav Shlomo Zalman said it is mukuyam by a chayal. Now, there are two versions to the story. I can't be machriya. Version one is even if the chayal was not a Shomer Shabbos. Version two, Shomer Shabbos. Okay, as I say, I don't know which story was accurate, but still, the idea that a chayal was Moser Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, in a way, is even more plausible than Holocaust survivor. Meaning, the Holocaust survivor, you have the issue that they were victims; they didn't have choice. The chayal, is affirmatively making decisions for the benefit of the Jewish people. So. This is, again, a little bit of controversy. Of course, this reminds me a little bit of a very famous remark that Rav Soloveitchik said, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik said. He was asked about the significance of the Israeli flag. Some shuls, even in Chutz La'aretz, they actually like to have an Israeli flag, a United States flag, let's say in America, and an Israeli flag. So first of all, Rav Soloveitchik had a little bit of an ambivalent attitude. He actually did not like what you might call ceremonies that were outside of the framework of halacha. He didn't like flags. He didn't like anything that was not part of the halachic Messiah. So he was not excited about the flag. But he did say there was something very significant in the Israeli flag in the following way. We know that when a person dies, we do a tahara. We wash the body, and that includes washing off blood. Let me just put this back on. Cleaning the body. But it's brought down that if a person died al Kiddush Hashem, a person, let's say, was killed by a terrorist or whatever, we actually keep the bloody clothes on him. We keep. And even though we put on tachrichem, we put tachrichem on top of the bloody clothes, so that those bloody clothes of martyrdom should kind of be seen by Hashem. And it'll be a source of divine memory and eventual retribution for the murders of people who died because they were Jewish. So Rav Soloveitchik said, if the bloody clothes of the martyr are said to be a memory, whatever that means exactly, a memory to God of the evil that was perpetrated, then the flag of the state of Israel is a reminder, so to speak, of all of the Jewish blood that has been shed. And therefore, it does have a certain spiritual significance because it recounts to Hashem, again, whatever that means exactly, but it is a symbolic recounting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu of the sacrifices of the Jewish people. Now, again, we're actually living through this, since October 7, 2023, and now a new offensive, a new aggressive offensive in Gaza. Chayolim are, people are dying. Hostages are still at risk. So we hope that Hashem will look at the Israeli flag, as Rav Soloveitchik said, and see the deaths of the Jewish people and their sacrifices, and may it be a source of rachamim. But as I say, the Kiddush of the Rambam, that martyrdom gets folded into Kiddush Hashem, and failure to give your life is Chilul Hashem, is actually a Kiddush, because once again, I want to emphasize, Kiddush Hashem itself does not create the duty of martyrdom, because after all, for Shabbos, Pikuach Nefesh will override that. Chilul Hashem does not create the duty of martyrdom, but once we define that duty by other sources, it'll be folded into the definition of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. Okay, so when is there a duty of martyrdom? So as we said last week, and as you know generally, there are only 3 averos for which a person must give his life before he succumbs. We call them the big 3, or the Gimel Chamuros, right? Gimel Chamuros, Shalosh Chamurot, and they are Avodah Zarah, they are idolatry, Gilui Arayos, sexual immorality, and shvichat damim, and murder of the innocent, as opposed to the rodef, which of course you can kill. But killing an innocent person to save a life is not going to be permitted. And for a whole kol TORAH kula, Shabbos, Kashrus, Yom Kippur, the halacha is ya'avor v'yal yehareg, transgress and do not allow yourself to be killed. But for the Gimel Chamuros, the klal is yehareg v'yal ya'avor. You must give up your life rather than transgress. And once again, the Rambam says, and if you give up your life, you are makadesh et Hashem. Right, this is where he folds it in. If you lack the courage to give up your life, you are a mechalel et Hashem. Now, the Rambam then goes further. There are a few points about this. So, for everything else, transgress for pikuach nefesh. For the big 3, you must give your life. Now, what if a person is so committed to the mitzvot that he wants to give his life before he transgresses anything? Let's assume that someone goes over to him and says, violate Shabbos or I'll kill you. Now, the halacha is, you violate Shabbos. But what if he loves the Torah so much that he wants to die even for other transgressions? He would rather die than violate Shabbos. He would rather die than eat on Yom Kippur. Is there a concept of voluntary martyrdom when the Torah does not obligate you to give your life. So the Shitas of Rambam is very interesting. The Rambam categorically rejects voluntary martyrdom. When the Torah does not obligate you to give up your life, you are not allowed to give up your life. And if you give up your life when the Torah does not obligate you, you are a suicide who has committed a very, very grave sin. So according to the Rambam, there's never a middle way. There is either an obligation to give up your life for the big three and other things I'll talk about in a few moments, or there is a prohibition to give up your life for everything else. So the Rambam rejects what we might call voluntary martyrdom. However, I have to say that the overall context of Jewish history actually rejects this ruling of the Rambam, and indeed, we have countless cases of people who did indeed give their life rather than transgress the Torah, even when they were not obligated to do so. So this issue about voluntary martyrdom is interesting. Now, I want to point out an interesting point that I've already mentioned more than once, and I'm going to mention it again as we go through this. Rabbi, Dr., Professor Chaim Soloveitchik's series of essays on the Maimar Kiddush Hashem, in which he actually argues that the Maimar Kiddush Hashem is a work of rhetoric and not a pure work of halacha, because there are many statements in the Maimar Kiddush Hashem which contradict the final halacha as codified in the Rambam's own Mishnah Torah, written many years later. Now, I do have to say, the mere fact that the Maimar Kiddush Hashem contradicts the Mishnah Torah does not indicate it was not an accurate statement of halacha. I mean, the Maimar Kiddush Hashem was written when the Rambam was 27. The Mishnah Torah was completed when the Rambam was 45. If there are inconsistencies, that's not necessarily because the Rambam was covering up halacha. It could be that he changed his mind over the course of years. But one of the very interesting dichotomies is that precisely in Maimar Kiddush Hashem, where the Rambam concludes that the people did not have to give up their lives before they profess Islam, the Rambam says, but if you wanted to do so, you could do so, and that would be called a Kiddush Hashem. Now, that is a direct contradiction to what he says in Perek Hey, Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, in the Mishnah Torah, where the Rambam rejects voluntary martyrdom. So because of this, Rav Soloveitchik draws the following conclusion. Really, the Rambam held they should have given their lives in Igeret Taman as well. He didn't want to say it. That would have been too hard of a standard. So instead he said, if you're up to it. Because if indeed the Rambam seriously maintained there was no obligation to give up your life in the Moroccan situation, then he wouldn't have allowed voluntarily giving up your life. So if he allows voluntarily giving up your life, Professor Soloveitchik suggests he actually maintains you're chayav to give up your life, but he didn't want to go that far. That's why he called it an act of rhetoric, an act of comfort, an act of chizuk, a letter of chizuk, but not necessarily a definitive halachic ruling. Again, though, in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says categorically there is no such thing as voluntary martyrdom. Now, this comes up a lot in terms of volunteerism. Can a person, the Goyim surround a city, and the Goyim say, give us a Jew to kill, or we will wipe out the whole city. So the halacha is clear that we are not allowed to pick a Jew and send him out, even if that means the whole city is going to be wiped out, because the rule that you can't murder or cause murder to save lives even means if you're saving a lot of lives. It's not a one-to-one. We don't do a numbers game. So the question people ask is, could a person volunteer? Could a person say, I will give my life so the city will be saved? Or what about the person who jumps on a grenade to save other people? Now, the question becomes, if the Rambam says when there's not an obligation to give your life, you're not allowed to do so, so is this person, God forbid, a sinner? We would hate to envision him that way. So, interesting question. Perhaps according to the Rambam, you're not allowed to do that. But the counter-argument is that in cases like jumping on the grenade, or in cases like volunteering, the person's going to die anyway. Meaning, if he doesn't volunteer, if he doesn't jump on the grenade, everybody's going to probably get killed. So that's a little different, meaning you're not talking about a person who would otherwise live who volunteers to give up his life. You're talking about a person who would die with everybody else, but he's willing to step forward to save everybody else. So it might be, in that particular case, the Rambam would allow a voluntary martyrdom, but in cases where just some innocent person just comes forward and says, take me instead of him, at least according to the Rambam, that would not be permitted. But as I say, the flow of Jewish history has not followed the Rambam on that point. In fact, I believe they said by the Ger Rebbe, one of many stories, that the Ger Rebbe was the Rebbe of the largest Hasidus in Poland. Ger was super in terms of numbers, the very, very large Hasidus in Poland. And the Germans considered the Ger Rebbe like the rabbi of the Jews of Poland. So they were looking for the Ger Rebbe, who was Baruch Hashem, eventually smuggled out the Imrei Emes and got to Eretz Yisrael, but he was very, very high on the list. And at one point, the Nazis actually got to the home where the Rebbe was hiding, and they said, where is the rabbi? And Hasidic Yid with a big white beard stepped forward and said, I am the rabbi. And they shot him dead immediately. Essentially what he did was he impersonated. He said he was the Ger Rebbe, so they would kill him rather than look for the Rebbe. So again, you could describe this in different ways. You could say this was a suicide. Or you could say this was an altruistic act of rescue to rescue a great, great tzaddik. So it seems that, just literally, that the Rambam might not have approved of that. The Rambam would not have approved of giving up your life to save another person, because the Rambam says martyrdom is either an obligation or a prohibition, and there's certainly no obligation to give your life to save somebody else. On the other hand, I'll repeat that Jewish history has not followed the Rambam, and there are many, many, many instances of people voluntarily giving their lives to save other people, whether it be your own children or whether it just be a tzaddik or whatever it is. But nevertheless, that is the Rambam's view, that there is no concept of voluntary martyrdom. Now, let's go further. What if a person was supposed to give up his life? Right? The Crusades. The non-Jew says, bow down to the idol or I'll kill you. The response is, give up my life, die. What if I didn't? What if I did bow down to the idol? What if I did convert to Christianity, at least externally? Marranos, Jews professed faith in Christianity, even though they kept the Torah privately. So here's what the Rambam says, an interesting point. And this is even true with murder. Whether it's avodah zarah, whether it's a sexual avera, or even if you murdered somebody to save your life, which you're not allowed to do. So here the Rambam makes a very interesting distinction between before the fact and after the fact. Before the fact, if you ask a shaila, should I bow down to the idol or die? The answer is die. Should I rape this woman or die? The answer is die. Should I murder this person to save my life? The answer is no, die. But once you did it, the Rambam says the following: any act that was done under coercion or fear of death is not legally punishable. So if you murdered an innocent person to save your life, you would not get any penalty on the part of a Beis Din. Right? If you worshipped avodah zarah, again, your only sin, which is a serious sin, is you desecrated God's name by failing to give your life. So you're over on Chilul Hashem, which is bad, very, very bad. But you're technically not an idolater, and you're not a murderer, you're not a rapist. Because the Rambam says, even though you should have given your life, you acted under duress. You acted under compulsion, because you acted because of fear for your life. Now, this itself is very important in the Mamar Kiddush Hashem scenario, because what it's saying is the following. Even if they should have given up their lives, which the Rambam maintains they didn't have to, and we'll get to that, after the fact, they're still Jews in good standing, unlike what that rabbi told them, that their mitzvahs don't count. So this is an extremely important distinction the Rambam makes between before the fact and after the fact. And the Rambam maintains that after the fact, there is no punishment that is attaching to them, because they are called anusim. They are called people who were forced into it by virtue of compulsion. But here we do have a very, very fascinating contradiction in the Rambam, which he does not raise in this letter, but it's raised in the Mishnah Torah, so I'm going to mention it, and that is the following. The Rambam says, the same rules that apply when a guy goes over to me and says, do this sin or I'll kill you, will also apply in the case of illness. Let's assume that a person is ill. Person is dying. And the only way he could save his life, let's imagine, is by drinking some fresh human blood, by killing somebody. Again, I can't really make up a realistic case, but something like that. So the Rambam says, the same way you can't murder in response to a non-Jew threatening you, you can't do it to save yourself from illness. So Shabbos, Kashrus, Yom Kippur, Pikuach Nefesh, for sure overrides. But the big three, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayah, Shvichus Damim, you cannot do even to save your life in the case of Choli. But here, the Rambam says the following idea. If a person violated the big three in order to save his life from a fatal illness, there he would actually get punished for his sin after the fact. As the Rambam is machalek between a person who acts under the duress of another person versus a person who acts under the duress of an illness, which will save him. So an example would be, you're not allowed to get benefit from idolatry, right? If you have an idolatrous tree, you're not allowed to get benefit from it, and that's called Avodah Zarah itself, just getting benefit. So if this tree would have medicinal properties, you would not be allowed to use the tree even to save your life. But the Rambam says if you did use the tree, you would be chayav misa after the fact for Avodah Zarah. So this is a very famous question. What is the difference between choli and coercion? Meaning, if a guy says to me, bow down to this idol or I'll kill you, I must die. But if I didn't die, I don't get punished because I acted under duress. Now, if I'm faced with a situation, use this idolatrous tree for medical reasons, or you will die. Once again, I'm supposed to die, but if I use the tree, I will be guilty of Avodah Zarah, and if witnesses warned me not to do it, I would get the death penalty. So what is the nafkamina? What is the difference between choli, sickness, and coercion on the part of a third person? So it's a famous question. It's a well-known stira, a well-known contradiction in the Rambam's words. But the Or Sameach, or Meir Simcha of Devinsk, does offer a distinction, and he says, in the case of the non-Jewish oppressor, by the way, it could be a Jewish oppressor too. I mean, the Gemara always uses non-Jewish oppressors because it could not envision a Jewish person doing it, but, there's no difference here if the oppressor is Jewish or non-Jewish, who says to me, bow down to the idol or I'll kill you. So his will is being superimposed on my will. So as a result, my decision to bow down to an idol in order not to endanger my life is a coercion that overpowers my will, and therefore, even though before the fact I should have given my life, to be sure, but after the fact, I don't get punished. In the case of the holy, the sickness itself is not pushing you in a certain direction. It's your decision that you want to heal your sickness by taking this idolatrous treatment, but there's no direct imposition on your will. Okay, it's a subtle distinction, just to be aware of it. I don't want to be marich in it too much. Okay, so far, I've only mentioned 3 cases where you have to give your life: avodah zarah, gilui arayot, shvichas damim. But now we have to go a little further. The Rambam, and again, the Rambam didn't make this up. This is all based on Talmudic discussion. The Rambam then goes on and says there are times you must give your life even for other things. And he says the following. He says, if the sin is going to be committed publicly, and publicly is defined not necessarily in such a large audience, in front of at least 10 Jews, that's called publicly, there's a minyan. And the guy's motivation. See, there are 2 types of motivations here. When someone tells me, let's take Shabbos, someone says, mow the lawn or I'll kill you. Now, there might be 2 different reasons why he says, mow the lawn or I'll kill you. One reason might be, it has nothing to do with Shabbos and nothing to do with Frumkeit. He just wants the lawn mowed, and he's a crazy guy who's going to kill me if I don't mow the lawn. Meaning he's not doing it because he wants me to transgress my religion. He's doing it because he wants me to mow the lawn. That is a category that is called hanoas atzmo. That he's not doing it to take me away from the Torah. He's doing it for his own benefit. That's one motive. A second motive is lahaviro al hadast. That is dalet taf. His motive is specifically to wean me away from my religious observance. So here is what the Rambam says. If, I do want to apologize to the Gentiles of the world. I keep on using the example of a goy, but again, I'm not suggesting that all goyim do this, and I'm not suggesting that the halacha would be different for a Jew. I'm just using the goy as the example that is in rabbinic literature, including the Rambam. So apologies to the non-Jews of the world, if any of them are listening. So we have a situation. The guy goes over to me and says, mow that lawn or I'll kill you. And he does it to me, he says it to me, where 10 Jews are watching. 10 Jews are watching. So the Rambam says, it depends on what the motivation is. If the motivation is hanoat atzmo, he's not telling me to mow the lawn because he wants me to violate the Torah. He's telling me to mow the lawn because he wants that lawn mowed or he'll kill me. A crazy king. So there the Rambam says we do apply pikuach nefesh, even publicly, and go ahead and mow the lawn. But, says the Rambam, note 2 conditions here. If the Aveira is gonna be public, and the motivation is specifically geared to my repudiation of the Torah, note the 2 conditions. Public and lahavirai aladas, So in such a situation, the duty of martyrdom applies to every single mitzvah of the Torah, no matter how small that would be. Okay, it's not only Shabbos. Shabbos is a serious violation, but even something like, if you put on tefillin, I'm going to kill you. Or, the Talmud says, even minhagei Yisrael that are not even halachically valid. The Gemara gives a case of a shoelace. Let's assume that there was a minhag that Jewish people wore black shoelaces, and the Umot HaOlam wore red shoelaces. And the government decrees all Jews must wear red shoelaces, or they will be killed. The Gemara says, if the purpose of the Gezerah was simply a narishkeit, we want everybody to dress the same, that's fine. Go to red shoelaces. But if the intention is to wean Jews away from their religious observance by creating assimilation, even changing a shoelace is yehoreg v'yal yavor. Now, an example of this actually was in the 19th century in Galicia. Some of you might have family from Galicia. My own parents were from Galicia. So Galicia was Polish, Austrian, German borders, etc. And Galicia had two opposite trends. It's very interesting, two opposite trends in the 19th century. It was a very, very heavily Hasidic part of Poland, but also it had tremendous Haskalah at the same time. So you had opposite forces. You had many, 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 many Maskilim, and you had many, many, many Hasidim. And unfortunately, the Maskilim, and this is kind of a badge of shame, very much wanted to crush the Hasidim. They were constantly making accusations against the Hasidic communities to the government of disloyalty and everything else. And therefore, a lot of the government's negative responses to Hasidim came from accusations of the Maskilim. Now, again, we can be an even opportunity condemner. I mean, Hasidim kind of hit back with some shots of their own. It was very, very nasty. Jews were attacking each other and going to the government. Kind of like what people do today in building. Someone wants to build something, and people are always reporting to the area and everything else. So here is the thing. At some point, the government in Galicia, which was part of the Hungarian Empire, wanted to prohibit Hasidim from dressing in their distinctive way. They can't wear shtreimels. Of course, originally, shtreimels were in fact the hat of Polish nobility, originally. But by the 19th century, it did become a distinctively Hasidic levush. And they actually declared Jews cannot dress in Hasidic garb. It was against the law. So the Hasidic Rebbes of Poland actually paskined, Yehareg v'al Yavor. They must even be willing to die before they change their levush. Now, I understand when you first hear that, that sounds very, very extreme. But in point of fact, it seems to exactly be what the Rambam is saying, based on the Gemara, that when the kavanah of the oppressor is not for his convenience, but it's lahaviro aladat, then there's going to be a chiyuv to give your life, even on a minor thing like the distinctively Jewish levush. I think it is fairly clear that the motive of the government was to take people away from at least traditional Judaism. That might be lavir aladas. Now, it gets a little complicated. The reason why it gets a little complicated is the maskilim wouldn't describe it as that. The maskilim might say, oh, we're not trying to take you away from Judaism. We just want you to have a more modern type of Judaism. I mean, you see, it's a little semantic. It's not that we want to take you away from Torah. We want to take you away from the excesses of Hasidus. So that's an interesting question. Is that nichlal in lahaviro aladas? Okay. So the point is, though, based on this ruling, you actually see that the duty of martyrdom can potentially be much, much broader than the big three. So now let me ask you a simple question. Let's consider a concentration camp. So Jews often had to work on Shabbos. And if they wouldn't work on Shabbos, if they refused to work on Shabbos, they would be killed. They were served non-kosher food. If they would refuse to take it, they might be killed even then, besides starving to death or the like. So here's the question. And again, I hate to talk about this in theoretical sense because real people suffered real pain. So, of course, we have to feel their pain and feel their rachmanas. But just to analyze this academically, if a Nazi told someone, get this job done, operate this sewing, it's Shabbos, operate this sewing machine, or I'm going to kill you. Would we tell the person, what would the Rav say? And there were Rabbanim in the concentration camp who paskin shaylas. People would ask Rabbanim. Would the Rav say, work, 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 it's pikuach nefesh, don't desecrate Shabbos so they shouldn't kill you? That's one approach. Or would we say that if the goal of Nazism was to take Jews away from the Torah, and there were 10 Jews present, would we say you have to give your life? Now, I will tell you, as a matter of historical record, the psak that was given by every posek I'm aware of was pikuach nefesh. People were told to work on Shabbos. People were told to eat treif. Even though some of the rabbis who gave them that psak, they themselves did not eat treif, that was their thing, but they gave a hedger to other people. So the bottom line was that people had rabbinic psak that they must violate Shabbos and they must violate kashrus. The question I'm going to leave you with is, I get pikuach nefesh, but what about this rule that where the motivation of the oppressor is to take you away from your religion, and it's done in front of 10 Jews, you are mechuyav to give up your life, even beyond the big three, even for Shabbos, even for minhagim, but kal v'chomer for Shabbos. Meaning, was Nazi Germany, or not was Nazism, were the concentration camps an example of lahaviro al hadas? It's actually a little confusing. It's not so easy, and again, I hate to be so academic here, but it's not so easy to characterize Nazism as lavir al hadas, because the Nazis were not interested in converting us. The Nazis were interested in extinguishing us. So you could actually say their motive was not to take us away from Judaism. Their motive was just to kill us. And therefore, pikuach nefesh would still work. On the other hand, that's not quite true. Although it's true that Nazism was not trying to convert us, but part of the extermination plan was to demoralize us by taking us away from the Torah that gave us a certain amount of comfort. Meaning, when a Nazi said, operate that sewing machine on Shabbos, they weren't indifferent to the fact that it was Shabbos. There was something part of their diabolical plan that it be on Shabbos. So that's the issue. If the crazy king doesn't even know it's Shabbos and tells you to mow the lawn, that's a pure hanoat atzmo, and mow the lawn on Shabbos. But here, I think there was a mixed motive. Yeah, they were going to exterminate us anyway, but I think there was a plan to wean us away from the Torah and the mitzvahs. So I'm going to leave it as a question. We'll talk more about this next week. But the point I wanted to introduce today was the very important point that the duty of martyrdom can and does extend beyond the big three when you have a combination of two conditions: parhesia, public, in front of 10 Jews, and the motive is lahaviro al hadas, rather than hanoat atzmo. So if it's private, then even if the motive is to take me away from religion, it's mutar. And if it's public and the motive is that for convenience of the guy, it's also mutar. You have to have two conditions, bifarhesia and lavir aladas. And the question I'm leaving for your cogitation is whether Nazism would qualify as lavir aladat, or because since it was a pure extermination system, we don't treat that in that manner. Okay, we will continue next week because again, the Rambam does have to deal with this particular shmad that was going on. Yeah.